Hi, I'm Chad Johnson with Truss Components of Washington. I've been in the roof truss industry since 1990, and so that's almost 35 years. Today, we're going to talk about open web floor trusses, some comparisons to other floor framing methods, why you might want to use an open web floor truss instead of something else. So basically, an open web wood floor truss is consisting of a top and a bottom cord, much like a roof truss. And then that top and bottom cord are connected by webs in either a Warren pattern or in a Pratt pattern, or also we might call that K-web. Those web patterns are named after the people that invented them, and the reason that we have the webs is to transfer loads between the top and bottom. So the top of a floor truss is a 2x4, except we refer to it as a 4x2 because instead of being on edge, it's laid flat and gives a nice wide nailing surface. But look at me, I'm already getting into advantages. So this is what a floor truss looks like basically, and let's get into some more detail. So we talked just about the very basics of the open web floor truss construction, but let's talk a little bit about the anatomy. So the open web wood floor truss is made up of a top cord, which is where the floor would go, a bottom cord, which is where the ceiling would go, and then webs, which go in between the top and bottom cord to transfer forces between the top and basically between the top and bottom and the bearing points at the ends or anywhere along the truss. Okay, let's take a minute and let's compare traditional methods of floor joist framing with open web floor trusses. So in pretty much every floor system, there's going to be let's say it's either a wall or a foundation or something along those lines, but it's going to create the bearing perimeter for that joist system. And the joist system is going to be composed of members that span from one side to the next, and those carry the floor and the ceiling, floor above and ceiling below. Traditional methods of framing a floor system, the joists might be solid sawn lumber. For instance, they might be a 2x8, and that member would be spanning from one bearing point to another, and there would be a series of 2x8s making up the joist. It could be 2x10, 2x12, and so that comes directly out of a tree in a single piece. It uses quite a bit of lumber for the strength that you get out of it. More recently, I-joists have become a popular option, and they're called I-joists because the end of them looks like an I. And those are made of a solid top and a solid bottom with a web in between, and that web there might be OSB or it might be plywood, and that gives the strength to transfer forces from the top to the bottom and out to the ends of that joist. Now, one thing that you'll notice about these traditional methods of floor framing, these types of joists, is that they are solid. So that is just one big piece of lumber, or it's a solid web in between that top and bottom. And so if you want to move any mechanical, like your ductwork for your heating and cooling system, or plumbing, or electrical, anything like that, you have to drill holes through those joists. And that reduces the structural integrity of those joists, and it's also extra labor. Now, if we take a look back at the floor trusses that we were talking about, the open web wood floor trusses, they are made up of the top and bottom, and then webs in between, which leave all sorts of open space where you can run plumbing or ductwork without modifying the truss at all. Saves labor, and with the truss being made of 2x4 members, it uses much less material to create the same strength and the same span. By the way, those wood members are held together by metal plates, much like a roof truss, and so at each one of these joints there would be a plate holding that truss together. When it comes to what type of building you would want to put an open web floor truss on, there aren't really a lot of limits. It really comes down to a decision about what makes the most sense economically, and then what makes the most sense from an energy and labor standpoint. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we don't often encourage people to put open web floor trusses on the first level of a structure, because we build with a crawl space typically that's not accessible. And so from an economic standpoint, using a shallow I-joist with multiple supports, it tends to work out pretty well. So for instance, if we're building a single-story house with a shallow foundation that is only going to be accessed ever in order to maybe do maintenance under the floor, then it's pretty typical to just use like 9.5-inch I-joists, and then they'll have support running down the center of them. Now, once we get above that first level, so we'll take this from a 3D down to a 2D here. Once we get above that first level, then we have different considerations. So this is our first floor here. We would have the ground or the dirt filled up to that point. And then when we get to our second floor, now we don't want to have a bunch of interior supports for the second floor of our house, and so we might want a truss that can span a longer distance than what a traditional joist can. And additionally, now that we're up inside the house, we can bring our heating ductwork, our cooling ductwork, our plumbing, and our electrical into the webs of those trusses, which keeps it in conditioned space. It's not only friendly from an environmental standpoint of using less energy, but it's friendly to the wallet because your power bills are going to be reduced. Also, if you are in a situation where maybe with a traditional floor joist, you would need to put some of that ductwork down below your floor system, that could cause you to need to build in soffits, which would make your ceiling not be flat. And so you can avoid that by using a open web floor truss. Another question might be, are open web floor trusses usable for residential, for commercial applications, multifamily? And the answer is all of the above. So it's very common to have open web floor trusses on two-story residential projects, residential project with a basement where you want to get the most space out of the basement that you can. Also apartment buildings, hotels, all of those buildings use open web floor trusses on a regular basis, as do many commercial buildings like doctor's offices or those sort of things. Okay, so in addition to being able to run your mechanical and your plumbing and that sort of thing through the trusses, there are a bunch of other benefits for the open web truss versus a traditional joist. For one, we can build these trusses in lengths up to 36 feet long. So if you have a building that is, let's say, 36 feet from one end to the other, and you don't want to have interior supports, well, it's going to be hard to find a 36-foot long 2x8, for instance. And even if you did, it wouldn't likely be able to support the weight of a floor system for that span. With I-joists, you can get those in the long lengths, but they become expensive and deep in order to make those spans, or you might need to put them very close together. So with floor trusses, we can build them up to a 36-foot span, we can build them up to a 24-inch depth, and we can adjust the spacing in order to get the best deflection performance out of that truss. And deflection refers basically to how much a truss will bend in between its supports. And you don't want so much deflection that it causes a sag. You also don't want it to be so stiff that the floor vibrates as you walk around. So we can design just the right amount of deflection. Additionally, if you're using I-joists or solid sawn lumber, that's going to come out to your job site in a random length, so to speak. So if you need, like we were talking about, that 36-foot span, they're going to be roughly cut, if you get I-joists, for instance, to that 36-foot length, but then the framer on site is going to need to cut them to the exact length that they need to be. Whereas if you're using pre-manufactured floor trusses, your floor truss manufacturer is going to build them to exactly the length that they need to be, so you can bring them out to the job site and just set them in place. Some other advantages are if you do have an interior support, let's say you have a beam in the middle, and you have joists that are coming to each side of that. If you're using solid sawn or I-joists, you're going to need to install hangers to support those joists, whereas if you're doing floor trusses, we can eliminate the need for the hanger by extending the top cord of that truss over that bearing. So it's very labor friendly in that way. And again, they come out to the job site already built like that. So we can conceal those beams and keep your ceiling nice and flat. Also, at the ends of the truss, at the outside wall, it's traditional to have what we call a rim joist go all the way around the building and tie everything together. But if we're using a floor, and that rim joist would need to be the same depth as the I-joist or the solid sawn member. But if we're using a floor truss, we can notch out the top of it, and that leaves a space for a 2x4 to tie those trusses together. So much less material, more cost effective. How fast can I frame with a open web floor truss system versus another joist system? Goodness knows that we are all pressed for time, and when it comes to open web floor trusses, they are the fastest way to frame a floor system for a couple of reasons. One is that they're going to come out to the job site already built to the length that they need to be. So it's just a matter of putting them in place, no cutting necessary. Additionally, like we talked about a little bit earlier in the video, we can design to eliminate hangers. So the beams that you might have in place in your floor system, we can just set the trusses right on those, and you can keep moving along. No need to add costly and labor-intensive hangers. So durability of open web floor trusses compared to solid sawn joists or I-joists is pretty similar. And maintenance isn't really a consideration anymore for the floor trusses than it would be for any other wood frame component inside of a house. If you wanted to do a remodel in the future, adjustments can be made, but aside from actually changing the building or some event that occurs due to a storm or something like that, there just isn't going to be much need at all to perform maintenance on a floor truss system. So let's talk about some of the environmental benefits of the open web wood trusses, and additionally some benefits economically to the contractor. So let's talk about a traditional joist being a 2x12, for instance. So a 2x12 solid sawn member is going to be 11¼ inches tall and 1½ inches wide, and that is solid material all the way through. We're limited to that 11¼ inch depth, and because we're limited to that depth, we're going to be limited to the span that we can cover, and we're going to be limited to how far apart those joists can be spaced in order to make the deflection criteria, the load carrying capacity that we need to make. Now, if we take a look at a wood floor truss, that's going to be built with 4x2 material. And then it's going to be webs, and so we get a lot of open space. And so, for instance, we can build an 18-inch deep truss with about the same amount of material per lineal foot as a 2x12. It's actually a little bit less. It's more like the same amount as a 2x10. Then, because we've got more depth, we can space them further apart. So where your traditional solid sawn floor truss is going to be at 12 inches on center or 16 inches on center, we can very easily make most floor trusses work at 19.2 inches on center or 24 inches on center. So that means less trusses, less material, less labor to handle them. Also, because we build those trusses, like we talked about a little bit before, at the proper length when they come out to the job site, we're not going to be cutting parts of those trusses off and throwing them in the dumpster, which means less waste going into the landfill. But additionally, all of that material that you might cut off of the solid sawn joist is material that you paid for, so you're paying for it twice in that case. Once, 3 times. You're paying for the raw material, and then you're paying the framer to cut that material off, and then you're paying the dump to accept that waste when you haul it there. So economically and environmentally, less impactful to use the wood floor trusses, the open web wood floor trusses versus solid sawn material. With I-joists, they're pretty friendly on the amount of material that they require to make the same spans, but again, you're going to have to trim them on site to the correct spans, and so you're going to have waste that's going to go to the landfill. Another thing that aids with the speed and ease of using floor trusses is if we're delivering to a second floor or third floor, for instance, they will typically be set in bundles on those levels of the building with the boom truck that is delivering them. And with an I-joist package, that's usually going to be delivered to the ground, or a solid sawn floor package would be delivered to the ground, and then the on-site labor is going to need to lift all of those pieces into position. It's just extra handling and extra time. So occasionally the question comes up, how much weight can a floor truss support? Well, most of us don't have elephants in our houses, but we could design a floor truss that would support the weight of an elephant. It really comes down to knowing what the loads are that we're going to be supporting. Most of the time, it's just a matter of floor, which is, carpet or tile or laminate, and then the ceiling. Additionally, we might have insulation, and in some applications, especially where we're trying to eliminate noise transfer between levels in the building, there might be the flooring over concrete on top of the wood that would be on top of the trusses. And so we can support pretty much whatever we want to, as long as we know ahead of time what we're supporting. It could be a hot tub, it could be a pool table, it could be whatever you like. We just design for it. So we'll make the trusses as deep as they need to be and adjust the spacing as necessary so that they can support whatever load it is that you intend to have on the floor trusses. Well, with any truss package, your truss supplier will do everything they can to make sure that they come out to the job site absolutely correct with no need for modification. But occasionally, whether it's roof trusses or floor trusses or wall panels, any one of those pre-manufactured products could potentially need to have some modification due to a condition on site that was unanticipated or different than what the designer expected. What does that mean? Well, that means that we will find out what the conditions are that we need to adjust for. We will reach out to the engineer who designed the trusses and put their seal on them, and we'll find out what the appropriate modification is. For instance, let's say that we did a 30-foot truss, only to find out on site that the foundation was 28 feet. So what would we do? We would reach out to the engineer of record and let them know, hey, we need to make these trusses 2 feet shorter, and they will come back to us with an engineered repair that has a guarantee on it as long as the instructions are followed, and that truss can be modified, and now you can have a 28-foot truss where you started out with a 30. Same could go for if your truss needs to be a little bit longer, or maybe there's a pipe coming down and the truss needs to be cut for that pipe. Any sort of repair that might need to be done or modification, we can generally figure out a solution for that. In the worst case scenario, we can just replace a truss. Not a big deal. I'm glad that we had this chance to talk today, and if you would like to learn more about floor trusses, in the notes below there's a link to this floor truss guide, and this floor truss guide covers things like what are the allowable spans, what kind of bearing options do we have, and many different details about floor trusses. So I would definitely recommend clicking on the link down below and getting this great information about floor trusses.